So yeah, I actually talked with Shrikant, and this was the title so far. Our title, as you can see on the title page, it says "Help me with creating a subtitle," and so I'm certainly excited for any kind of feedback that you guys might have to offer from this. So this slide presentation is actually kind of an overview of the book. Something Shrikant told me when we were looking at it is you want to engage your reader, and if you have like some big point to make and it's in the last chapter, they may never get there. And so you want to kind of have your bottom line up front. So probably the introduction to the book, my intention is to be like an overview of all the chapters, and so that's kind of what we're doing today, is giving an overview. Let's see. There we are. So bottom left, I up front. This is a book about kind of in Protestant circles, they do this thing where they talk about justification and they talk about sanctification as two separate works. Justification being the moment of salvation and sanctification being the progressive growth in the Christian life, usually ethically and moral growth that's going on there. In the course of my thesis, I stumbled on the whole notion of theosis from the Eastern Orthodox tradition and found a lot of people discussing this from evangelical perspectives. And there seemed to be a lot of correlation between that and this idea of sanctification. So what we have here is I have a definition there of sanctification kind of blended in, coordinating with this concept of theosis. Sanctification is the grace empowered process by which the believer, through union with Christ and the Holy Spirit, is restored in the image of God and transfigured into the likeness of Christ, what the Eastern tradition calls theosis. And so now we're kind of envisioning sanctification not just as like some sort of moral purity test, but kind of a reclaiming of the Imago Dei. And that's kind of the idea of theosis going on in there. It's personally transformative in the individual's life. A lot of discussion on theosis talk about it being corporately transformative, as like we're talking about church communities and parachurch ministries. Somehow capturing the image of God and their functionality and their corporate structure. And it's also missional in revealing Christ to the world. The idea of theosis is that we've taken part of the nature of God in some sense to where we reveal God to the world just as a natural consequence of our lives. Thumbs up. Does that make sense so far? All right. So chapter 1 is why Christian ethics feels broken. What we find is that in earliest stories, some of the earliest church fathers, is this discussion of people who claim to be Christians, but they don't live a Christian life. And so seems to be a debate that's been ongoing since its inception. We see that even in the early Pauline epistles, where he's talking about Hymenaeus and Alexander in one of the epistles, Hymenaeus and Philetus in another example. Galatians begins with Paul being upset with some people, the Judaizers in Galatian. And you have different people claiming to be Christians but not necessarily upholding it. Charity was a large part of the Christian witness. A wonderful man, Rodney Stark. The title of the book escapes me right now, but he was a sociologist and he discussed the role of Christianity in the earliest centuries and how it was unique in providing like almost like a mini welfare state in the community. When there were plagues and famines and things like that, the Christians would stay behind and help each other out and help other people in the area. When lots of times the Roman people would just flee the scene, especially if there was a plague. It was common for especially the wealthy people, to just leave the city and go retire to their countryside homes, just kind of escape the plague and wait for it to die out. But Christians somehow stay behind, and that was a witness that was clearly observed. Um, what we're noticing now, and this is really kind of what inspired me to do the thesis in the first place, is this idea is we have this, what I would call it, an ontological separation of faith and works, is that people talk about having faith, um, talk about believing in Jesus. We say like, oh, I'm going to accept Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. I'm going to go to church and do the religious things, take communion, be baptized, all that other stuff. But then the rest of the life is just like discordant. It's incongruent with the profession of faith. Um, and so you see people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer in Germany, especially in World War II, who talks about a reunification of faith and practice. And actually, that's the term that they use, is this ontological separation, or an ontological union of faith and practice. One analogy, I got a few analogies for you, is like, you can't really call yourself a farmer if you're not plowing the field. Or when I was working in mental health, and we would talk about faith and cognitive restructuring and say, okay, everybody here believes in chairs, right? You sit in chairs, and everybody's sitting in a chair. And so like faith is always demonstrated by works. And so there's this idea, we see it in the New Testament, especially in the Epistle of James, of this idea of like a real genuine faith naturally produces works, naturally produces charity, and these attributes of love. Um, at the core of what's going on is, and especially if you have access to the news, is you'll see stuff like sexual abuse cases in the Catholic Church and Episcopal churches. We're finding out about widespread abuse of Indigenous people, especially in Canada and some of these, early missionary schools. Just 2 years ago, the Southern Baptist Convention was found to have been withholding information and covering up abuse amongst their clergy over decades of time. And there's constantly these things going on. And so the question is like how is this going on in churches? And part of it is when you go and examine these churches, they're really working hard to save face for the organization because they believe that the ministry is important, and they don't want to sully the ministry or stop the ministry or stop ministering to people because of a scandal. So they kind of have an incentive um, to cover up or to hide these things, or to try to kind of do this in-house to not make it public. And that kind of pricked my heart a little bit, and was really kind of the motivation of it, is that I don't know that you can separate the two, and that part of that the organization needs to uphold its same morality. And that's what we talk about, this ontological separation, when we have a ministry that we want to preserve, but in the meantime we're going to cover up abuse that's happening within the ministry. And so now we've created this separation of like what the ministry is, and we separate it from the ethics that are supposed to be like the sine qua non of Christianity and Christian values, in the Christian life, the life of which is to look like Jesus. So the second chapter is to kind of like a little bit closely look into, how does this happen, and kind of imagine like what is the Imago Dei, um, in Genesis 1, and how is man affected by the fall. Uh, in chapter 2, what we'll get at, so like chapter 1 really kind of captures the problem of what's happening, this discontinuity between faith and practice. And chapter 2 kind of looks at is like, what is it supposed to be like? And what I really like is, in like, we all know that mankind was created in the image and likeness of God, and you have this word for image and likeness is sometimes used elsewhere for idols and idolatry and and graven images. And the idea is there that mankind really is literally that image of God. It's like the representative God on earth. And there's a sense that when mankind is given dominion, is our mission is to rule in God's stead. We're like an extension of God's will on the earth, and that's kind of the ideal state of affairs. And I think that the garden imagery is significant too, in that like a garden, the idea of the garden is we already have an abundant earth, and we're increasing the abundance of an already abundant earth. And so that's like mankind's mission of dominion isn't one of exploitation or just the earth belongs to us and let's tear it apart. It's really just kind of the idea of is that we're contributing to the flourishing, as an extension of God's rule. We're contributing to the flourishing of the whole created order, not just ourselves, but the creatures and the plants and the everything that's in it. Um, and so that's what's going on there. But then we talk what happens after the fall. And so this is where, I'm able to did in my thesis, I did a lot of human subject research. And what we found is the big one that sticks out to me is that, if I were to poll everybody in a room and say on a scale of 1 to 10, how smart are you? Most of us would be able to accurately, we have awareness of our own IQ and how smart we are compared to the average person, and we would more or less be accurate in that assessment. But if we ask people in a room, how moral are you? Ethically, are you compared to your peers? For whatever reason, most people see themselves as being paragons of virtue and being more moral than 90% of the other people. And so we have this weird paradox where, for most things in life, we seem to have insight of what we're like. But when it comes to morality, everybody seems to have this inflated ego all of a sudden, thinking that we're better than everybody else. And that's pretty consistent. Like 90% of the people will rate themselves, mathematically and possibly 90% will rate themselves as being 90% more moral than the other people in the room. When we do more human behavior, studies, we see that at the core of it is self-interest. Even when people make ethical decisions, they seem to be motivated by self-interest, and they'll go back and forth between ethical paradigms. Like they'll choose maybe a utilitarian model of like, okay, what are the outcomes in here? And if the outcome favors them, then they'll adjust their ethical reasoning, their moral reasoning, in order to serve their own objectives. And if that doesn't work, they'll adjust it to say, maybe a more of a rules-based approach or a policy approach. You'll see people shuffle back and forth between consequences or policies or rules based on whatever the outcome is going to be. And that's pretty consistent. Another thing that happens is this idea of, I found something called moral dumbfoundedness. Lots of times we have very strong moral convictions. And then when you ask somebody, okay, why do you believe what you believe? The vast majority of what we believe, we couldn't really tell you why. And so, one of my favorite ones, because I grew up with this, I was raised believing that homosexuality was just absolutely wrong and it was an abomination before God. And if you asked me why is it wrong, I would just say because it's wrong and it's an abomination before God. I didn't really have any answer to it except that that's what I was told. And then, and that's, and I would argue that most Christians, when people oppose it, at least from a Christian perspective, that's ultimately what they're going to rely on is the Bible says this. And then having gone back to school, I realized that like many of the verses that people would cite for it aren't about homosexual at all. They're about sexual assault, rape. Most of us would agree that rape is bad. And then we can come up with moral reasoning for it. It's like violating another person's autonomy. Big bad. We can think through that morally. But yeah, moral dumbfoundedness is a big thing. We have a lot of convictions. We have a lot of moral values that we're just are part of who we are, and we don't necessarily know what they are. We don't know how to reason through them. So that's kind of the idea of where this book is getting back to is, we're looking at the problem with the church. We're looking at the problem with man. And the last point I have there is the need for a pole star to function as a moral compass, which is back to the very beginning. This idea of theosis is that Jesus, through the incarnation, appears as the ideal person. This is the second Adam. This is the person that we are supposed to be. And so if we have ambiguity on what is our moral direction in anything, we have the example of Jesus to look to. And so that leads us to, because this is a book ultimately on ethics, is something called ethics in the ethical term. This is probably, for me, an exciting chapter, but for the average person reading this, probably the most boring chapter. And in my draft, I even say, like, chapter in the first paragraph is, this is probably the most boring part of the whole thing, is you have to talk to people about different ethical theories in order to discuss about what's wrong. The biggest one that comes up most commonly, and I think is what's kind of plaguing, especially our political landscape right now, is different versions of utilitarianism. And utilitarianism is where, what we're looking at are what are the consequences of our actions, and so we might have some sort of moral objective, whatever that might be, and so we pass laws or we have values, and ultimately it's about achieving whatever that objective is. Think of anything. um Actually, yeah. um here's one example. I have a lot of friends that are very libertarian, and one of their mantras is taxation is theft. And so because taxation is theft, then we want to get rid of taxes. And so that's everything taxes. And so, the consequences of not having taxes is that we can't pay for public infrastructure. We can't, we might cut funding to schools, we might cut funding to Medicare, we might cut funding to our police station, whatever else it is. And so there's all this stuff that might happen in the meantime. But taxation is theft. So depending on how important your moral objective is, you justify the means along the way. And so in that aspect, utilitarianism, there's a branch of it called dirty hands utilitarianism. That's where we consciously know we're doing something wrong. We know that this thing is objectively wrong. Most people would see that as wrong, but our end goal is so important to us that we will justify violence to instantiate this perspective of justice, whatever that happens to be. And so when I talk about this problem of this ontological separation of faith and acts, what I'm getting at is that the means to the end need to be the same. It doesn't matter what your objective really is. If the means there requires a conscious engagement in evil, you doing something wrong, then we're engaged in that, what we call an ontological separation of faith and acts. And so this idea of theosis is to bring these things together. You see this also, and the reason why this kind of gets important is that, especially in the first century, they talked about virtue ethics, that morality is grounded in the idea of who are we becoming. And so again, it's this ontological unity of the person and what they do. And so, if loyalty is a virtue, then I need to be the kind of person that behaves with loyalty. If justice is a virtue, then I want to be a person who acts and engages, in actions that are just all the time. And so I'm not so much, first off, we can't predict with any certainty what the consequences of our actions are going to be. And we don't always know what the right thing to do is in any situation. But I do know that I'm an honest person, that I don't want to lie. And so over time, practicing honesty in myself, it stops to become just this thing that I know I ought to do, and it becomes ingrained in me as a virtue. I become an honest person. And that's the rationale behind virtue ethics, is this becoming of who we are. And the cardinal virtues being temperance, at least in Greek philosophy, were temperance, justice, courage, and wisdom. And so it's like cultivating those things, that I want to be a person who acts wisely. I want to be somebody that's not an ascetic, but also not overindulgent. I want to be somebody who has a concept of justice and wants to be fair towards other people, and to have that going on. As you can see on this, I have the different ethical theories. Virtue ethics is right there with our first century teachings. and I have theosis right under that. And the difference, I would say they're very similar. The difference being that in theosis, what we're doing is we're looking to Jesus. We're trying to say, this is the paragon that we want to be. And so we want to cultivate in ourselves the virtues that Jesus had. We want to just naturally, as a consequence of our life, when we're engaged with a moral paradigm, or a moral dilemma or something's going on, that, what people see in me is the maker, is the acts of Jesus. And so I see ethics as a remedy to to this ontological separation, especially when we get to like virtue ethics and whatnot, and theosis. Um, Back to like what I was saying is some theories are concerned with moral actions, like deontology and authoritarian ethics, whatnot, is we've externalized. I just read this in a research paper today. That was the word that they used. We've externalized our ethics as something outside of us. The act itself is right or the act itself is wrong. Or in utilitarianism, the consequence is a good consequence or a bad consequence. But with virtue ethics and with theosis, we're kind of like bringing it back to us. We're internalizing it and asking ourselves, are my actions, or what am I doing? Am I a good person? Am I a virtuous person? Am I just? Am I honest? Am I loyal? Am I all those things? And so it's about cultivating those things internalized. Um, so chapter 4, which again this is one that I don't know how much people would enjoy or not like, um, is the idea is what did moral instruction look like in the classical period? And again, it's like we have all these different paradigms now, like deontology, utilitarianism. But virtue ethics really ruled the school. That was like the dominant, just about everybody thought in terms of virtue ethics. How to actualize it, there was some debate on that. Generally, people kind of had the same ideas that it's about character cultivation, um, and the way to do it is to mimic other people. And here I kind of like, you can't really see it too clearly, but it's a slave boy looking up at Aristotle saying, who is the virtuous man? And you have this big crowd of faceless people and Aristotle saying, there he is. um, and I bring that up because that was the biggest critique of virtue ethics, is we know we want to cultivate virtues. We know that the way to cultivate them is to imitate them in other virtuous people. Um, but that's a hard target. We don't have a clear definition of what any of those are. And if you read any of the Plato's Socratic dialogues, that's really like at the core of the debate is what is justice? What is courage? How do you define them? And they go back and forth. And usually at the end, they don't really come. They have learned a lot along the way, but they haven't come to a fixed thing. They can't say this is what it is. And that's kind of the issue. And that's also where in theosis, it's like, especially in the Gospel of John, that's Christianity's answer to the question of what are the virtues and what does the virtuous man look like, is that we have this biography through the synoptics and the Gospel of John. We have this biography of Jesus. And so we can actually say, there he is. That's the virtuous man. That's the person that we're supposed to emulate. And you see this also in the writings of Paul. There's a handful of instances where he's like, hey, you're wondering what to do, imitate me as I imitate Christ. I'm here trying to follow Christ's example. If you're wondering what to do, we're going to engage in what's called mimesis. We're going to imitate this. And so that's really kind of Christianity's answer to it all, is they have this one person. You'll also see, especially in Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic and any of that branch, traditional Christianity, is icons and saints and these hagiographies, like really big ones, because each of those people will have like they'll excel in certain virtues. And the idea isn't so much, again, it's not so much like we're worshiping these people, it's that these people excelled through some aspect of their life. And so this is, if we're wondering how do we what do we want to become, we can look to a saint and we can follow that pattern in our own lives. I was thinking in the Protestant in Protestant faiths, Fox's Book of Martyrs was really big. For a long time, that was like the second most owned book in colonial America, next to the Bible. And it's just this big fat book of people who have, from all history, some of them, way back in early church times, of people who have died for their faith. And so reading hagiographies, reading the lives of saints has been something that's part of Christian tradition from the very beginning. Um, Chapter 5, necessary and sufficient. In this chapter, we'll probably get at something. So this is a debate that Aristotle had with the Stoics, even though they were separated. Aristotle would say that, humanity has intelligence in a way that the animals don't. Um, Humanity has a moral sense in the way that the rest of creation doesn't. And so therefore, to be a flourishing human, to be the best possible person that you need to be, is we need to exercise these talents. The flourishing human, the best possible version of yourself, is one that exercises these unique attributes that only you have. Everybody is on board with that. Aristotle also argued that you also have to be good looking and have some wealth and not be a slave and be a man. You can't be a woman. And you need certain material things in order to also be a flourishing person. And so he would say that virtue is necessary but not sufficient. Where the Stoics disagreed, Epictetus among them, foremost of them, then he was a slave, he would say, no, the virtues are necessary and sufficient in and of themselves. And so that's kind of the debate that's going on there. When we read the Bible, there's this interesting tension there in that ultimately it looks that, theosis and being with God, we see this all over the place. In the bottom, I have some verses. Psalm 63:3 is one, your love is better than life. This idea of the it's necessary and it's sufficient. If I have God's love, I don't need anything else. John 10:10 is the famous one. I have come, the thief comes to steal, to kill, to destroy, but I have come that you might have life and that you might have it more abundantly. And then First John 5:12 is he who has the Son has life. And so in our New Testament discussion on it, it really does, especially John chapter 15, when it talks about the vine and the branches. If you abide in me and I in you, every branch that is grafted into me will bear great fruit. You have this idea of the sufficiency of Christ. With that said, every single story of Jesus, all the synoptics, and the Gospel of John, you see Jesus really reaching out and helping people who are poor. And that kind of accords itself with a lot of research that's gone on now. Is like when you have nothing, a little bit of stuff goes a long way in improving your happiness. If you're not eating and you have no place to stay, if you're living under a bridge, a little bit of sufficiency really does help. Once you have that, then more doesn't make you happier. If that was the case, then Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates would be in a state of eternal bliss. But we know that that's not true. And Elon Musk would be the happiest man in the world because he's the richest man in the world. That's we all know that that's not true. So more wealth, more stuff doesn't make you necessarily happier. So anyhow, that's really there's a lot of research out right now. Just as I did human subject research in chapter 2 regarding what's the moral condition of man, there's a lot of research in the field called positive psychology where they say, what are the things that actually make people happy? And what you find is that there's a lot of correlation between what the Bible describes and what the peer human subject research really communicates. Big among them is a family. The longest standing research study, the longitudinal study coming out of Harvard, is going on 70 some odd years right now. It's just been they started studying a group of men, and then they started studying their wives and their children, and so it's just carrying on in perpetuity. And they find that the biggest predictor of health, of life satisfaction, is the quality of the relationships that people have. Period. Heart disease, all this stuff has less to do with bacon and more to do with, are you around people that love you and that you love them, and do you have robust relationships? And that kind of floored me because, we grew up in, this environment where we're learning all this stuff, but the Harvard's is like, no, the not that the other stuff doesn't matter, but the biggest predictor of longevity and health and happiness is the quality of your relationships. Um, I bring that up because, again, what did our verses that we looked at? It's all about God as love, and he who loves knows God. That's there in First John. The great command that's repeated in all four of the synoptics and then recited again in Paul is straight out of Leviticus 19:18 and 19:34. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets are captured in this one command. And so, yeah, love and having relationships is key to all of it. And the research bears that out. I actually already covered this, the Harvard study and the biblical view. And so that's where I'm kind of back to getting at is what does theosis look like? And here we're getting really kind of down to the nuts and bolts of it. And saying like, okay, I think that's where ethics needs to be is really kind of focused on relationship building. Um, Finally, chapter 6, theosis and the Gospel of John. When we talk about theosis and the idea of like partaking in God's, participating in God's nature in some sense, um, it's really interesting because one of the first things Jesus talks about is, I think he makes the quote, "You will see you'll see the angels ascending and descending on the Son of Man," and he's alluding to Genesis when Jacob, slept on the rock and had a dream, and there was this ladder leading into heaven, and the angels were ascending and descending on Jacob's ladder. And the idea there is that Jesus exists as what Mircea Eliade would call an access mundi, the point in the earth where heaven and earth touch. And so when people go to the temple or go to a holy place or engage in a ritual, it's like this is a breach in the veil where heaven and earth come together and we have direct access to God. And so throughout the Gospel of John, you see Jesus continually making these statements where he depicts himself as this access mundi. He describes himself in terms like the temple was. When he makes the statement that out of one's belly will come rivers of water, this is an allusion to Ezekiel, this millennial temple that's spoken of in the later chapters of Ezekiel, where this river is flowing out of the temple and flows into the wilderness and brings life to the desert and goes on and feeds the whole world and the nations. Everybody benefits from it. You see this again, when Jesus meets the woman in the well and talks about this bubbling up. You'll have springs of living water, and she's like, "Where is this living water that I don't have to come back anymore? How do I get that?" And so these analogies keep coming up, and what it brings us to is the idea is that if we're partakers of the divine nature, then if we're indwelled by the Holy Spirit, then God really dwells in us. Everybody says this in Christian circles from the beginning to now, that our body is the temple of God, that God is dwelling in us. But the next step is that then we become the place where people have access. People who are outside the faith come to God through us. And that's really important as we become that access mundi. We end up taking on that aspect of the divine nature. And so being Christ-like it's so important, and this is where all of this is kind of coming to a head, is our character and our virtue and how we shine forth the image of Christ is the thing that is pivotal and most important. It's not some external, am I doing the right thing? Is such and such a sin? Am I going to accomplish, whatever social, legal agenda that I have accomplished? Is at the core of it is who are we becoming, and is Christ visible in us to the outsider? Because that's really the promise. Jesus says in John 12, if the Son of Man is lifted up, then he will draw all men unto him. It's like, are we the kind of person that when we are lifted up are drawing people to us? He then says, and when he gives the great command in John 13, love one another as I loved you. By this, all will know that you are my disciples, that you love one another. And so at the core of whatever it is that we do, whatever agenda that we might have, however we vote, whatever's going on, is the love of Jesus needs to be evident. And that's really kind of at the core of all of this. And so it's not so much what would Jesus do? That was a really popular saying for a long time, but it's nuanced. It's have I become like Jesus? Is it, it's, I'm no longer, it's like the whole idea of theosis is getting to a point where I'm not ruminating and anguishing on the right thing to do. Is my character has evolved to such a thing that my nature is such that all I want to do is make certain that people know how much I love them and that the love of God is there. Granted, we're not going to achieve that entirely in this lifetime, but that's the progress that we make. And so there's ideas like, ecclesial theosis is like back to like our discussion on the Southern Baptist Convention. If there's corruption, if somebody does a sin, something's going on in your organization, ecclesial theosis is about, is this body politic, is this church looking like Jesus? Do people look at us and say, okay, we did the right thing? If we have sin in our ranks, are we accountable to it? And do we stop it? Missional theosis, when we go out into the world, do people see Jesus in us? Et cetera, et cetera. I have in this slide, it says Arcadia and theosis in the Gospel of John. Arcadia is this idea of returning back to the garden. You'll see a lot of this theosis imagery really is like garden imagery. And so it's this picture of, back to a harmony with the universe, a harmony with the planet, harmony with the living things and the creatures on it. Again, it's a picture of love, this idea of harmony. And then finally, the last thing that I would have is, or what I would be working on, I talked to Shrikant about it, but my slides don't reflect it, is in the traditional concept of theosis, they talk about it in being in 3 stages. And the first stage is something called catharsis, where it's really a self-evaluation and a purging of ourselves. It's like a moral inventory and repentance and confession. And so my goal is that at each chapter, I'll identify spiritual practices that are actionable. So as the reader is going through, we can talk about that and how that plays out in the self and in the life of the church. So the first 2 chapters really kind of pertain to this idea of catharsis. The second level of, as progression, in Orthodox circles towards theosis, is this idea of the word they use is theoria, is this idea of getting a knowledge or a correct view of God. And so again, it's this revelatory aspect, and this is where the study and the theology, comes in and really, lifting up and, and increasing your knowledge of some of these deep theological truths. And then finally, the last section is theosis itself. And so it's like, I can't really emulate Jesus if I haven't done a moral accountability on myself and I haven't taken the time to figure out who Jesus is and to understand who he is. And so that's kind of your last step. And so, looking at the chapters, 1 and 2 is about the condition of man and the problem. Perfect. We'll have to discuss, catharsis. Second one is like, what is ethics? And what are virtue ethics and things like that. And so now we're getting into it. And then finally, theosis is that idea of what are we mimicking? What does it look like to mimic Jesus? What does theosis look like in the life of the church? And thank you all for hanging out with me for this presentation. That is it. That's all of it. Yes, DLJ. And I don't know how to you know what I'll do is I'll make Shrikant the host until I learn how to unmute people and do all of that stuff. Do you have it now?
I have
You're
it.
still...
Thank you.
Okay.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yep.
Well,
Oh,
so overall comments about the book, what do you think of the book?
Overall comments. I was going to give a detailed critique.
No, that's fine.
But first of all, Gary, I want to know, what are you after here? Do you want a critique or do you want encouragement?
Both.
Both. Okay.
I like the critique actually, because yeah, it needs to be intelligible and it has to be relevant.
Okay, I've got a lot of notes because you had a lot of stuff in there. So that's
Yeah.
the first encouragement. Well done. You've obviously given it a lot of deep thought. Well, you had your degree. Yeah, everything. Yeah.
And I passed. That's
And
the
you
most.
passed. Hey, bravo. All right, congrats. Well done on that one. Okay, so you've given us every slide had introduction.
Mhm.
So essentially what I think you're showing us there is the stuff that you want to put in the introduction to explain the rest of the book. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, good. Don't do that.
Don't do that.
Don't do that. Well, yes, you can do that to a degree, but I think here are the main beats I think you need to cover, because I didn't see them in the slide. Some bits I saw in the slides, so I'll retract that. First one is target audience. So it was actually presented, I think Shrikant said, this is a book for everybody. But I could tell straight away that it isn't, right? Because you've assumed a fall. Not everybody thinks that's a thing. That assumes belief. Not everybody's got the belief. You've assumed likeness of God. Not everybody believes in God. So do you want to actually go to, oh, well, I've got to prove God first, and then you don't want to do that, right? So I think
yeah. So I guess
hang on, you've talked about pole stars and paragons of virtue, etc. Well, the Islamic world where I live are going to go, we got one of those already, thanks very much. It's called Muhammad. So why do I need to read this book, right? So target audience is number one. Second one, you make your notes. I can write it in the chat if you like. It's only 4 bits, in fact 3.5 maybe. Target audience, who are you writing for? Second one is why are you writing it? And that did come across to some degree. But you had a number of things. So to live happier lives, to live longer lives was mentioned. You're creating future leaders who are going to lead by example. Is that what you want to do? Save the world. I mean, there's a number of things that came across of why you're writing it. And I think you need clarity in that so that people go, that's why, as opposed to a long list of things. Because I'm doing the same thing. I'm trying to write a book and I've got all these 500 different reasons why I'm writing it. That doesn't present well, I've learned. That's the second one. So why are you writing it? Third one, what's different to this compared to other stuff that's out there? So what's your differentiator? And that could lead to number 4. So a subset of that could, and the 4 is methods used, which you did come across. So it's about theosis and stuff, right? So the methods used comes across, and that could be the reason why you're writing it, because nobody else. So number 3, why is this different? Could be because of the method you're using, or it might be a different thing. Does that make sense? That's the end of my.
No, it does. It does.
Brief summary, and hopefully that wasn't too critical and it was encouraging enough.
No, I was expecting it to be more critical. If you
I've got more, but other hands are up.
Yeah.
Let's hear from everybody.
Yeah.
And then Gary, you can keep notes and you can respond to everybody
Yes.
once they are done. Joe, Paul, and Kwan. Joe.
Yeah, I mean, fantastic presentation, Gary. And appreciate the fact that you're actually, going through this.
Hi, Joe. It's been a while.
It has been a while. It's good to see you.
It's good to see you.
So, I think that you laid out, the problem that you're trying to solve, which I'm assuming to some degree is this idea of fragmentation, as you talked about it in a sense. So are you trying to recapture something from the past that isn't existing now? That's one of the things, is essentially, what are you trying to recapture? I would think needs to be highlighted clearly, because it seems like something's been lost. That's the impression that I got on your first slide. And so that was one aspect of it. The other is, if you're going to talk about the goal you mentioned is relationships and how we relate with one another, then you're going to have like kind of a way of decomposing those as to what types of relationships they are and what types of interactions even. And that brings me to something else. What I would be very, very careful of is conflating things like deontological utilitarianism and virtue ethics with authoritarianism, theosis, and egotism. Because the first 3 are really decision-making frameworks. And, things like your ego are something that is part of that process that is where you're coming into your to understanding yourself. So that's part of that process. And so that's one thing that I would really kind of be careful of conflating, those two ideas. One of the other things that I was going to say was I would highlight mimesis. I like how you went there with that. And the reason why I think that that's actually so important is because if you're focusing on virtue, the reason to be virtuous is to, I would say, change the input for someone. In other words, if somebody's acting out and doing something that's actually not necessarily the most pro-social act, well, your act may be a way to counter that, and that person may not have actually encountered a person that has actually treated them with respect or in a virtuous way. My point being is that you're acting virtuous to stop the cycle of actually to stop the cycle of people that are actually behaving in a way that would be otherwise not necessarily seen as facilitating good relationships. And to put it in DLJ's speak, to make it very simple, is change the input for people. That's essentially what it is. You're changing the input, the data that they're actually capturing. So I'll be interested to see the practices, but then I would also say if your main idea is focused on relationships, I would really focus on a way of kind of decomposing that. So anyway, great job though.
Thank you, Joe. Great, both DLJ and Joe. Great comments. Paul, followed by Kwan and Jeannie.
Yeah, thank you, Gary. Hi again, folks. Loved your comments, Joe and DLJ. Also, I'll build on some of them. And a quick nod to Kwan, who I haven't seen since the Tao Te Ching meetup. So glad to see. We'll be interested in hearing yours. But the part that, going back to DLJ's comments on the audience, I more assumed that you were going for an audience that is mostly has sort of a Christian-based framework already, as opposed to the absolute everybody. Okay, you're thumbs upping that. But that said, that casual Christian, I wouldn't even call myself as far as being a casual Christian, but taking myself, like the Latin term, for instance, Imago Dei, or the term theosis. A lot of very casual Christians still might call themselves Christians, but that's, no pun intended, Greek to them, Latin to them, right? So you kind of like got right into it, assuming everyone would like know all about that. That was my impression, because it's so second nature to you. So if you're going to appeal to a mass Christian audience, I think you need a little more elaboration on those base concepts at the beginning. And my second point is mostly about the chapter you said you thought would be the most boring. And it's kind of like so important, in my opinion. So you can't call it, you can't minimize it, and you got to be careful with it. That's where I had the biggest problem with the approach you took, which seemed to lump together modern policy making in government with child abuse. I mean, and then all the different things that can lead to bad decisions, and kind of dumping them in a rather cavalier manner into these categories, somewhat similar to the way Joe was talking. And those who, for instance, like a current governmental decision, and even sort of have a deeper view of utilitarianism as, no, it's not just think about solutions, it's greatest happiness for greatest number. We carefully weigh all these things, and he's just throwing all that under the bus. So I'm not saying I disagree with you, but I'm saying It needs a more respectful and careful treatment of those things. Those are my main comments. Loved your presentation, and I'm thinking a lot about this idea of being in the image of as a really important way to base your ethics on. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Well, it's just wonderful to have all these folks back and hearing them. So thank you very much. All of you, Joe, Paul, DLJ, Chini, it's been a long time. Kwan, Evanik, it's been a long time. So wonderful. Next up is going to be Kwan, Chini, and Evanik.
Yes, hi, Gary. Thank you for an outstanding presentation. I truly love it. I just want to start by mentioning that you are perfectly right by mentioning at the beginning of your presentation that most people are mostly right about the IQ, intellectual quotient, but not about the MQ, the moral quotient. And it's not a surprise because it's easier to learn concept and words than to have a space of awareness. And talking of space of awareness, I think that concerning the Christian framework, you should not compromise on the concepts and the vocabulary of the Christian tradition, but explain them truly exhaustively and comprehensively, because the Christian tradition has a wisdom, having its own way of speaking and its own way of describing stuff that is not the Buddhist tradition or the Jewish tradition or the Muslim tradition. So I think that that framework has to be kept. And I would like to say that I was absolutely delighted by the 3rd step of theosis, okay? Catharsis, theoria, and theosis itself. Because, I'm sorry, I'm a Buddhist by tradition, so it makes me think immediately to the Eightfold Noble Path, okay? And the Eightfold Noble Path is also divided in catharsis, theoria, and theosis, even if they don't use the same words, of course. The 3 words for catharsis in Sanskrit, it's Shila. For theoria is dhyana, and for theosis itself is prajna. So when I said that you should not compromise on the Christian vocabulary and concepts, it's because that tradition brings something special, and it might help some people. And to be really helping for those people, you should keep the teaching pure, if I may say so. I stop here.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Wonderful. Great observations. Thank you, Kwan. Next up is Chini, followed by Evanik.
Gary, I liked your presentation and positive affirmations all the way. But I should have just, looked up in a dictionary, but I wanted to see if you have a answer for the 2 words I didn't know, which was deontology. Is that what it was? DEON.
Deontological.
No, I don't think so. It was not. It didn't end in. It ended in ology, not.
Yeah, deontology.
Oh, okay. Oh, it's got a T in there.
I think, yeah.
Oh, okay, okay. And then the other one was Eschanian or something like that. It was toward the end. ESCHAION. Chanian. Uh-oh. I couldn't see them very well, but
Was it ecclesia?
it's toward the end. It was like one of the last slides. I just didn't know.
I think it is ecclesia, right?
Oh, ESCL?
That's correct.
Uh,
Sure
Gary,
you
you're
can.
Is it the word eschaton?
Yes, that's it. There's a T in there?
Yes. Yeah.
So those two words I didn't, if you could explain a little bit.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, that's easy. First off, I want to say, I could see you, like the people that are live, I could see you in it, and it was really encouraging. like, oh, there's actually an audience there, and so it really, got me feeling pretty good. So thank you. Just you being here was a good affirmation. Um, Deontology is an ethical system where certain acts have inherent moral worth. And so, one example would be it's always wrong to kill no matter what. That would be one version of it. There also like a branch of it where they would say rule deontology. It's always wrong to kill in cold blood. It's not wrong to kill in self-defense. And so we've made a rule about when something is okay and what's not, and to determine whether or not the act itself has inherent, moral worth, good or bad. And then the eschaton is a vision of what is the end state of things. What's the end of the world going to look like? In the Bible, you have, the new heavens and the new earth and the spaceship Jerusalem coming down on earth. And then you have all these prophecies throughout the Old and New Testaments talking about what it'll be like when Jesus comes. And the reason what I brought back is through all of these, whenever we talk about the presence of God, there's frequently this garden imagery. And so in Greek thought, they refer to it as Arcadia, this return to this blissful state before everything kind of changed, when we were in harmony with the earth and the trees and the rains and the animals and everything that was going on. And so when the tabernacle is built, in the wilderness, and when the temple is built, there's all this garden imagery carved into pomegranates and trees and stuff like this going on. You see this idea of this tree of life frequently talked about in the Bible, and and in artistic motifs. It's like this yearning for going back to this place when mankind walked and talked with God. And so you see that also in Jesus's own speech, when he talks about the waters and talks about the vine. It's like this return to the Garden of Eden, this place of comfort and harmony. So I hope that helps you. So the eschaton is whatever this end state is going to be. How is it described? And in the Bible, lots of times it's almost like this return to nature, the return to the natural things, return to the created order, the way things were intended to be.
wonderful. Next up is Evanique. And then Joe, if you want to add something to your comments for this one, Evanique, go ahead.
Yeah, Gary, this is so interesting. I think now when I saw your audience, or I was listening, I thought the audience was for Christians that want to go deeper in their knowledge. And I thought of, I know Paul was mentioning the casual Christian wouldn't be interested. And I agree, because I think a casual Christian, I'm not sure that's the definition of a Christian at all, but that could be me being judgmental. However, I just think, any Christian that wants to understand their faith more, I looked at that as like this book would be great for them. I think for people who want to learn about Christianity, I also thought, this would be a great book for them that want to learn more, go deeper, So I think what DLJ, the critique DLJ gave was good, because I think so many people like listening got so many different things. And I don't think it's necessarily even a bad thing, but it could be like, I think you as the author of this book, it's like a hard decision, right? Like, where do you go? Do you go more universal? And you try to kind of like address people who are interested in Christianity in general, knowing full well they're maybe coming from a religious background, or are you going to focus on, Christians that want to go deeper? And I think you can do both. I mean, people are going to be interested and people are going to be drawn to what they're going to be drawn to, but it's just something I think you could think about.
Thank you, Evanik. Joe, and then Katie, Marco, Ava, and Mike, if you would like to add anything, just overall impressions about the book. Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that, again, I failed to capture this the first time, but I think it's actually really important, is this this idea of what Quan was talking about is awareness. So you're talking about, an awareness as to the current environment that we're in, but also the self-awareness. And so I think you've touched on it, and it's more, I guess, a question whether or not this is the direction you're going. Are you looking to use something like St. Ignatius Loyola's practices as far as a way of actually, going through that process in a very practical way? And really kind of, I think what you also touched on, which I think is very important, is this other point, is that why be ethical? Because you talked a little bit about the positive psychology movement. It's aligned with that. You kind of are creating meaning, and you're finding meaning in the act of it, in and of itself. And I really would kind of call that out. Anyway, I thought that would be somewhat meaningful in this. One was the question, but the other is the idea of self-awareness, how that relates. But you're also bringing an awareness to this current state of Christianity and the landscape as we know it today. And as you'd mentioned, some of the lack of ethical behavior in many cases. So,
well, thank you, Joe. Katie, Ava, Marco, or Mike, would you like to add, your first impressions about the book? Okay. If you want to do it later on, you're welcome to do that. Gary, go ahead. Would you like to talk about all the feedback that you've gotten?
Yeah, I can tell you the audience I had in mind, and we discussed this actually quite extensively when we were doing our Gospel of John study group, is that any author is aware that regardless of who his intended audience is, you're also aware that this book is going to go in perpetuity beyond you. And so regardless of who John wrote to when he wrote the gospel, here it is 2,000 years later to a whole group of people. Shrikant on the other side of time is reading it now. And so there's this idea where the author is directing it to an audience, but also anticipating a wider audience. Like understanding is like trying to accommodate that. My audience is really I was raised in an environment where Christianity was politicized quite a bit. Here's an example is when I was in Bible college, they talked about a bombing of an abortion clinic and thought like, okay, that's fine. This guy is killing babies at the abortion clinic, and so bombing the clinic is justified. And I bring that up in one of the signature papers in my thesis that I started off with. Was a girl named Jennifer Nust, who was discussing the love command and how two preachers are arguing for and against slavery. Both of them are using the exact same Bible verse on love your neighbors as yourself. And one person is saying the most loving thing we could do is buy these slaves and give them good masters. And the other one's saying, no, what's wrong with you? Abolition is where it is. And so this is the disconnect that I'm kind of appealing to, is that from the very beginning, and this is answering Joe's question too, is what was lost from the very beginning. It was understood that we're supposed to be like Jesus, and that was a key of it. And when Paul argues against people and points the finger, that's usually his argument. Is like, this is what Jesus did, this is who Jesus was, and this is what we're supposed to be like, and Paul argued against, like, he says, yeah, here I was persecuting the gospel, here I was acting out violently. And so there's this gentleness that comes back, to it. And so that's where I'm concerned with, is that the instantiation of violence, which is being perpetuated by people who claim to be Christians because they have this idea of justice. And so my biggest target audience is this idea of this dirty hands ethics, that whatever it is that we're going to do is we can justify, our actions. The flip side to this is also this idea of these scandals. There's so many scandals of Christian organizations. This one guy, Ravi Zacharias, posthumously, it came out that he had, sexually abused dozens of people in his organization, for over decades. And everybody, it's not like it was a one-time thing or only the victims knew. People knew about it, and the organization kept it hush because, they didn't want to destroy this wonderful ministry that was reaching out to all of these people. And it's like, okay, we have this disconnect between the life we're supposed to live, and looking like Jesus, and this thing that we're going to call ministry, whatever it is. And I think that if you have a ministry that doesn't look like Jesus, then it's not a Christian ministry. Or I'm challenging that. It's like we really need to step back and ask ourselves, can we justify having a ministry when the ministry itself is engaging in activities that don't look like Jesus? And so that's the problem that I'm getting at, is all the things that we do in the name of Jesus. And before I answer that question, saw that a hand go up. You see that in John chapter 16. He says, people are going to persecute you. They're going to take you out. They're going to do things, all thinking that they're doing it in my name. And so I think that's the big warning that's taking place in the Gospel of John, is that, even Christians or people who claim to be Christians are going to be engaging in behaviors that's certainly un-Christ-like, thinking that they're doing God a favor. And that's really the example that we get even from Paul, the apostle, right? Is he was persecuting the church, as Saul of Tarsus, thinking he was doing a good thing for God, and so that's where I want to, like, a more Christ-focused Christianity. With that said, is right now some of the biggest detractors are people that aren't even Christians right now, are saying, wait, you're claiming to be Christian, but you don't look like Jesus, and so we there's a lot of vocal discussion right now, targeting Christian leaders, especially those that are more politically active, saying, like, things you're saying and doing do not look like Christ, and we don't understand where you come up with this. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's very good. Let's get comments from Mike. Mike, what do you think of the book?
I think I like what you did, and I like what you said, and I also like, but of course I'm biased because I liked your previous sessions with us. And I'll tell you,
Thank you, Mike.
Can you hear me? Oh, yes.
Yes.
Okay. The thing that I would suggest is some of the suggestions I've heard tonight are to write a book. But right now, I believe you're trying to write your master's thesis or PhD thesis, which you haven't got accepted yet. Is that correct? And if that's correct, you've got to write to the audience, which is your committee. And they might not need to have all the detailed exegesis of what all these things mean. You do need to have footnotes and refer to appendices, but then after you've written that—
Mike, let me interrupt you. Gary has escaped from that institution. He's completely been free for the last 2 years, and he wants to write the book that he wants to write. So there is no constraints from.
Okay, then I withdraw the entire comments, but having had some experience in the area, you're not writing, you can write another paper to the journals later that explains all this, but right now, but I have the wrong predicate, so I completely missed the, and thank you, Shrikant, for explaining that to me. I withdraw all the comments I made. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
Let me ask you this: when you escaped from the institution, did you escape with your degree?
Yes, I got my degree, defended my thesis successfully. I was actually invited into a PhD program, but I that's on hold right now, partly because I've been taking care of my dad.
Okay.
Yeah.
The one thing that I might suggest, without giving you a complete answer, just like they described that some of the journal you created built upon a single diagram or flow chart, like the tree of life. If you can relate to ethics in the same way, and that would be a PhD level thesis, if you could pull together a directed graph or an image that went to this concept of what ethics is in this context, and then you could recast the same thing, and it's not, and you can this thesis can have a life of its own in several different versions to several different audiences, and there are people, I don't know about in your discipline, but there are people in very complex disciplines who did their PhD while working full time at 2 different jobs. So I yield the balance of my time, as they say. Thank you.
Thank you.
Shrikant, you're on mute.
Mike, it's good to hear your voice. So thank you. Thank you very much. I mean, I really liked Kwan's comment that you have to remain true to the core of Christianity, because that's really what you have to offer. You know, there are so many people who do so much kind of analysis, but just like what we found in studying Tao Te Ching or Bhagavad Gita, kind of the core of what those works have is of lasting value. And that value is so much more than whatever kind of the modern versions that are there and whatever modern problems that we are faced with. So kind of making sure that you kind of just nail that, you know, unapologetically just nail that and say, this is what I'm seeing as what I think is the ideal. And then, you know, related to everything else. I think that there is no point watering it down, because if you water it down or make it, you know, kind of short so people don't get it, then they won't get the entire point.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm wondering what the next step will be. Do I just start working on chapter 1?
I have
Give
many
you a presentation on whatever I write?
I have detailed notes on every chapter, so I'll talk to you about that.
Okay.
So, but folks, I'm just so happy to do this series, because this allows us to kind of get back into this 3-part thing that we did of Tao Te Ching, Bhagavad Gita, and the Gospel of John. This is in some ways kind of continuation of the Gospel of John, because that's where everything, because what really matters is where are you going, and where Gary is going is the idea of theosis, which is really the key idea in Gospel of John, and then kind of relating it to modern times. So in a sense, you're seeing that, you know, this is a fallen world, And this is a solution to the fallen world. And, he describes various ways in which the world is fallen, where people are Christian only in name. Now, okay, by the way, name in Greek means onoma. Onoma means character. So when you say in the name of Christ, it actually means in the character of Christ, in the nature of Christ, which is what these people are not. So I think it's very powerful. He looks at things about, focus on the external things versus internal things, focus on kind of values, like utilitarianism is a version of focusing on values versus focusing on virtue. So moving from like external things by which you measure yourself, which we are pretty good at, to moving to something internal. And Gospel of John kind of develops that in a very, very elaborate way, very, very powerful way. And it has a lot to say for, to do that. But I think, yeah. Next up is Paul, followed by Jeannie. Paul.
Can I say one thing real quick before? First off, Evanique, thank you for that comment. That really was kind of the idea. Is like casting a broad thing, but I don't want to write a polemic that's targeting a bunch of people. I'm trying to figure out, like, how do I address the problem in a really good way that doesn't come across as hateful or arrogant or condescending, but really, is thought provoking. And then I also want it to exactly that, is there's a lot of Christians who are trying to figure it out, and how does this, that's the whole idea of the spiritual practice is like creating something that helps them to go deeper. And so you kind of nailed it. That's really, really what I'm hoping to do. I wanted to say, Quan, I really appreciated your comment. This is actually something I'd talked to Shrikant about in theosis, and how some concept of theosis, branches off. You see that in so many other religions, but that's not my forte. And so I'm really happy that you noticed it. That's your forte with Buddhism. I know a little bit about Buddhism, but I'm certainly not going to try to speak to something that I don't know a whole lot about. But I really appreciated your comment. That really encouraged me. And then finally, Paul, as we get to your questions there, that really stuck to me. The whole "don't call this boring." Everybody I know thinks that ethics is boring, but I personally find it to be exciting. When I joined my master's program, I already had an idea of what I wanted my thesis to be before I even took my first class. And they sat me down and said, "Hey, Gary, normally you take classes first, and then you find a professor, and then you guys agree on a subject of study. Very seldom does somebody just come up and say, 'This is what I want to write my thesis on,' and they don't even have an advisor yet." But they went with it, and they helped me with it. And so I ended up doing the thesis I wanted. But yeah, that's what I had to say. I wanted to say thank you for those comments. Those really stuck to me.
Thank you, Paul, followed by Jeannie. Paul.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, everyone, and Gary. I have a question. This isn't as much a comment as a question about a place. I got curious as we've been just talking since you did your whole presentation and the way the discussion flowed, and hearing about your intent, which is more focused than I recognized on sort of I want to say a critique, but I know you don't want to go into this bold, condescending territory, but pointing out that there's some places where the church has not looked like it was doing the things you're talking about. I'm being careful in my statement, but it brought up in my mind the history. And I'm wondering if you considered, this stuff has come in waves all the way back to John and Paul. And so the waves of the church falling away from this idea and then coming back to it. That stuff comes up in my mind now. Well, if you're going to go into we need to get sort of back to theosis. Well, did that happen in waves through the centuries? Does need to be a chapter on the history? Those are just questions that come up in my mind.
if I could respond just briefly, I have thought about that, and I wasn't certain if I wanted to do that. Some of it is really obvious, like we all know about the Inquisition. Most people could you really don't have to say a whole lot about Constantine, but like immediately after Constantine, then we started legislating some forms of Christian morality. And then you had, I can't remember her name. She was Greek philosopher, and she's like a martyr, a late martyr, but she was killed by a mob of angry Christians, is the short of it. Anyhow, my point being is like,
the name you are looking for is Hypatia.
that's it. Thank you. And so there's this funky thing that goes on, is that when Christians have political power, they end up using violence to instantiate their own particular views of justice. And it just seems to happen. And there's something, I'll probably insert some like biblical stories involved in it, but like a theme that's persistent through the Old Testament is literally God doing things because the people can't do it. They can't get themselves out of Egypt, so God does it. And they complain the whole time. At no point were they partners with God in the redemption out of Egypt. As soon as they cross the Red Sea, they're like, we want to go back to Egypt and get the leeks, like we don't have leeks in the desert. And then they complained that they didn't have any meat, so they got quail. And then they had manna, like God was there, and, water from the rock, every step of the way. They can't do it. Samuel and Kings, this is really interesting. And I'll probably try to find a place to put this in the book. It begins with the Ark of the Covenant being captured from Israel and taken to the Philistines. And then God basically saves himself. That there's so many plagues on the Philistines that they don't want the Ark anymore. When they put the Ark in the temple of Dagon, the idol of Dagon falls down, and its head and hands fall off. And so the Philistines are like, we need to get rid of this thing. And so the beginning of the story about the kings of Israel before Saul and David even come into power is God is perfectly capable of fighting all of his own battles, and he doesn't need you. What he does is he invites you to be with him as he creates this great work. And so when we talk about obedience and all this, we're being invited to participate in the redemptive work of God. And that's a restructuring of it. And so there's really I think that's part of what happens, or what motivates people when they want to get politically active in Christian circles, is they think that they need to march, they need to, Christianize society or something like that, or society is falling apart. No, God's going to do his work. And if you're having to abandon Christlikeness, if you're having to abandon the characters and the virtues that God wants in us, that obedience, in order to instantiate whatever form of justice you think it is, then you're like basically taking a stand against God. I'm thinking of the story of Joshua when he comes against the commander of the Lord's army, and he says, "Whose side are you on?" He says, "I'm not on anybody's side." And it's like, oh, what's going on there? Again, it's like God's going to go fight his own battles, and he's inviting you to be part of this redemptive work.
Can I add one thing in response to that?
Yeah, go for it.
You just convinced me you do need some of that context to bolster your whole worldview in the book. That was very helpful.
Okay,
I
thank you.
understand why your historical sweep, like how you see where we are, and how you see that it's not really new, and the way out of it. I don't know. Those are my thoughts. Thanks.
Yes. Thank you. I guess I'm thinking, I don't know that I need a whole long chapter, but I could cover it, as part of one of the other chapters. Or maybe I do. That's what this whole working group is about.
Yeah, one
Thank
quick is that, this is in human nature itself. This is there, you can always put it in terms of this political stuff, and this guy did that, and this organization did that. But this is all part of human nature, that we get, we focus on 10,000 things, And when we focus on 10,000 things, we are not focused on the Tao, and we lose the Tao. Tao still remains there, and you have the ability to return back to it. But this is human condition. So this is applicable at each individual level. So why would you expect this to be there, not there in kind of social structures across history? It has always been there. It will always be there. So that's not a problem. The problem is, how do you address that individual human being? And Jeannie.
Gary, these people is me. I'm so angry. I'm so unhappy. I'm not charitable at all. And I struggle with love. And if you can help me, thank you.
Thank you, Ginny. If I can help you, I will.
The only thing I know, Jeannie, that is very powerful is Gospel of John. You know, just reading, especially the ones, or the thing that Gary focused on, those, you know, the farewell chapters where he puts things down. And the thing is, you know, this is very different from the modern world. You know, this whole thing, you know, whether you look at Tao Te Ching, Bhagavad Gita, or the Bible, they're very, very different from the modern world. And we get focused on the modern world. So even if we are looking at these things, we look at it through the lens of the modern world. You kind of have to let the original text speak to you. And I think that's what, you know, I've found that that's really the core thing. You know, and this has happened for me for all these three, because it is showing a way of being which is actually not modern. You know, I think C.S. Lewis puts it very beautifully. The modern world has lost the Tao. We have lost the Tao. Tao is the integrating principle that puts everything, you know, that basically holds everything together. When you leave that, when you don't have that, you know, you're basically just scattered and so you're like a collection of scattered passions, interest, values. And what Gospel of John offers, what Tao offers, what Bhagavad Gita offers, is this element. It's almost like the modern world is operating on the two-dimensional field. This is a third dimension of spirit, and you can't really understand the matter. It's like, you know, there is this beautiful book called Flatland, of people living on the second dimensional thing and three-dimensional things interacting with it. So it's kind of very mysterious. It's like, you know, suddenly big things appear, these circles appear, they get smaller and smaller and vanish, you know, all kinds of things. So it's like that. It's a different angle. So that's all I can say. Gary, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, so I read a biography of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and one part of it that stood out to me was that when he came to the United States from Germany, he was only in the United States for 1 year, and he immediately started like participating in teaching Sunday school and like fully engaged in the life of this church, knowing that he wasn't going to be there for very long. But he's just like, I'm all in. And so when I moved out here to Boulder City, I did it to take care of my dad. I certainly didn't have as much zeal as Bonhoeffer, but you know, I found a church, I plugged into it, and then I just committed to, like, I'll say yes, whatever's going on, whatever invitations come, I'll just say yes, and I'll just participate in it. Ideologically, many of the people in this church are very opposite of where I believe. But on a personal level, like I just realized early on, is like I don't need to engage in all these divisive comments and all this other stuff. You know, I just need to be present with these people and try to love them as best as I can. And I'm a wounded person. And so I have a hard time building relationships. And in fact, they scare me. And when people reach out to me and say, hey, let's go do this, you know, my first impulse is to run the opposite direction. I have in some ways, like in the past, I had a very hard time being charitable. My last 2 jobs that I've had, I've done much better. Right now, my dad just passed away a couple weeks ago, and I have to like I'm just observing my behavior, like almost disassociating, observing it from the outside. And I see myself as having lately having a very short temper, not as patient as I can. Like I'm still trying to help out and do stuff, but it's like, frustrated easy. I don't want to talk to people on the phone when they call. Like that's just part of who we are. But I am plugged into a community. And it's all it was really at the core of it was just showing up. And I don't know if that helps you, but I remember like years and years ago, I just kind of learned it as I realized that I ended up sabotaging my relationships. I was sabotaging my job. I was sabotaging the relationship I had with my boss. And when I realized that I didn't know how to fix it, I did realize that I had the power to just shut up. So when something bothered me, I said, I have absolute 100% faith that I can make this worse. So my only goal is to not make it worse. And so I would just shut up. So that was the first, and it took a long time, many, many months, maybe a year or two. I never repaired that relationship with my boss or anything, but I did learn how to mitigate disaster by just shutting up. It was like, I don't know the right thing to do, but I know the wrong thing to do, and I'm going to stop. And so I don't know if that's helpful. But yeah, I just started showing up, and when I catch myself like wanting to argue, I just say, that's not going to be fruitful. The other flip side is I didn't realize it. I'll tell this story. I think I told Shrikant this one. I went to the bank the other day, and this is the bank that took care of my dad for years and years and years. And they're the ones that had reached out to me to invite me because dad needed help, and they were trying to find some family member, and they found me on Facebook. And so here I am 4 years later. I'm getting ready to close the accounts. I let them know that dad passed away, and the lady starts crying. And so I was like, I didn't realize that, Frank meant so much to you. I'm sorry I didn't visit more often. She's like, oh, that's not why I'm crying. I'm crying because when we called you, you didn't even think twice. You just came out here to help. And you have no idea how that impacted the people at the bank, is that there is some hope in the world that people will just come and take care of each other. And so there's just showing up sometimes, like that wasn't something I was trying to do. And I'm not telling the story to like, build myself up or anything. Is like sometimes you just don't even know the impact that you have on people when you just show up. And that's really all it was. Here I was thinking that for the past 4 years, the people at the bank didn't like me because I didn't visit so often. I only showed up to withdraw money. And then I find out that, every time they saw me it was giving them hope. And so it's like, oh, okay, that's kind of good.
That was
I hope
beautiful.
that's helpful.
Thank you, Gary. That was beautiful. Joe.
Yeah, that was beautiful. I mean, in the sense that, the small acts have, have impacts like far beyond what we actually realize. And obviously I'm sorry for what you're going through, but I appreciate you showing up tonight. So I mean, that was a lot in and of itself.
It's because of Shrikant.
That's a compliment. And I guess in one way I was just actually thinking when you were speaking too, is this, I don't know, there's this almost an idea of self-forgiveness that you could actually put it, kind of work into the book in a way. And, thinking along those lines. Just another practical kind of question, and I don't mean to bring it back to that right now, because obviously what you just shared was really powerful. And I think actually what you just shared is exactly why you practice virtue. That's exactly the example that I was kind of looking for before when I say you just do the right thing, because that stops the cycle for someone else and it brings them hope, as you were mentioning.
Can I add one thing to that?
Please.
When, again, this is just a weird, uncanny thing, is when I found out that dad was sick, and all that, there was never any deliberation. It was just obvious, like, oh, the thing to do is to go take care of him right away. And I guess, and I bring that up as like, not that I'm a paragon of virtue, but that's kind of the idea of the goal of virtue ethics is that at some point with many of the things in life, this deliberation of, weighing pros and cons just kind of falls away. It's like, oh, the right thing to do is so obvious. It's kind of plain to read. So there's something that's revelatory. It's like what Shrikant just told us. It's the Tao, and then when you're living in accordance with the Tao, you just, it's way, woo, way. I'm just going along with the Tao. It's effortless action.
Yeah, in a sense, it's what is meaningful. And this is the idea of what does it mean to pursue a meaningful life? It's kind of being there in those moments, whether it be for, someone else or your father or anybody in that particular instant, when you're needed. And not when necessarily it's not always convenient. But there's no regret with that. And that's actually something that brings people a lot of peace. And to be quite honest, that's where meaning is derived from. And I think that that's actually what's in most need in today's world more than anything else. I think we do have a crisis of meaning. I was gonna maybe I'll bring it up in other sessions, this idea between faith and practice, how that would look like on a practical level, because obviously there are many Christian faiths and how that relates to like the practices you can kind of figure out, but how do you if you're linking between this idea, the union of faith and practice, which version of Christianity are you growing with? I mean, because that has to somehow be addressed, because there are some very deep differences, obviously, amongst obviously a lot of different between Protestants, Christian or Catholics and Orthodox and everybody for that matter. So that's just, if you're making that union, it's something along the lines that you have to consider.
Yeah, my thought was to have a wide variety of practices, because like the Lectio Divina is something that I was introduced to through my Protestant, not even a Protestant church. It's like almost a Baptistic, non-denominational church. And that the same group of people that were doing that had previously done a study group where they were reading the I'm going to say it wrong, Philokalia, and going through that, doing readings from that and meditating on that and having a discussion on that. And so there seems to be, when it comes to spiritual practices, how you get there, there seems to be a wider variety of it, and an openness to a receptiveness of different traditions in going through it. And but I think that what they all have in common are the canonical gospels. And so whichever practice you use, the whole idea is that we're fixing our eyes on Jesus, who's the author and finisher of our faith. And all of them, I mean, that's something that across denominations has been persistent, is living a life that models Jesus. And again, for whatever reason, we've come up with the idea that love doesn't necessarily mean love. Sometimes it means tough love, and so Martin Luther then writes that, soldiers have to fight and kill and do all this other stuff too, and that is an act of love. Whether you justify going to war or not, I still don't think you can call that love, like Martin Luther calls it. Putin quotes John 15 with regards to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, saying it's an act of love. No man has greater love than to lay his life down for his friends. I hear that from military people here in the U.S. every Veterans Day and every Memorial Day, quoting John 15. It's like, well, regardless of where you stand on war and the army and patriotism, I don't think that's an act of love. You know, we're taking that verse completely out of context. Jesus, like later on in that right there, says before Pilate and says, my kingdom is not of this world, otherwise my followers would fight for me. You know, he actually says it's not war. He's pretty explicit, you know, on that one there. So we got to be mindful on some of this stuff.
Just really quickly, another comment. I mean, maybe this, I don't know if this would work or not. You know, the practices I think are going to be somewhat standard. You know, that those aren't where the controversies will be. You know, kind of lie. Again, it's going to be more on the faith theory. That what do you believe and why are you practicing X? But maybe something that you could do is kind of focus on what each group belief system within Christianity brings that's healthy, and then have a practice with that, so that then they can actually see the value in each other. You know, so you're highlighting, like, it's something where it's a unifying kind of way of writing it. You know, what is it that Episcopalians believe and what do they practice, and that highlighting, you know, something that if you're you know, if you're a Catholic and you read that's going to resonate with them. And the reason I say that is because sometimes there's going to be a fundamental difference in their practices and how, based off of your beliefs. So just as if you were to say you're an Epicurean versus a Stoic, those would lead to different decisions at some point. Because, you know, one's seeking pleasure, the other one's seeking virtue. Anyway, my point being is that by maybe coming away with something that is, you know, kind of highlighting the best in each one of those belief systems might be helpful in unifying different groups. And
Go ahead.
You
Gary.
could.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding is that it is Christ who unifies everything. So when you go back to the Gospels, so for example, one of the things that I liked about this is that 3-step process, right? I always think of it as sanctification. Sanctification is just kind of washing away all the 10,000 things that you are focused on. It's basically kind of, you know, we have a lot of things that are kind of clogging up our heart, and we need to kind of remove those. That's the, you know, old man has to die. So that's like the death. And then the theoria is all about kind of taking in Christ. So it's like continuously kind of taking in a lot. His own words, not interpretation. His own words, the scripture. It's very, very powerful, where you kind of start to form an idea of what Christ is. And then is the theosis. So I think that kind of, but the thing is that we always need that sanctification. And that's forever. You have to always be standing in the Jordan. You know, you can't go away from Jordan. You know, when you're talking about other things with kind of a holier than thou kind of approach, you don't realize that you yourself have that in you. And everybody has that in themselves, and they will always have it. And in spite of that, you have, you know, this grace that can come if you prepare for it by kind of cleaning yourself out. So Gary, I'm very, very excited. We're at almost 11, you know, close to 11 o'clock. Any kind of final kind of 1 or 2 sentence comments? I'm very excited about the series, by the way. So I just, you know, I can't wait to have Gary keep coming back every Thursday. And I hope all of you guys could make it. You know, it's going to be a very special series. And it's kind of, I mean, it's a very ambitious project. So I think we will all learn a lot from it. So just, you know, just go around and what are your, like, 1 or 2, well, you know, just few sentences, 30 seconds, Evany?
Me or everybody else?
Everybody else, not you. You don't matter. Everybody else.
All right. Okay.
Evany, what do you think?
I am looking forward to this. I think this is going to be really interesting and fun, and it's great to get everybody's thoughts. I think it's good to kind of like go around and hear everybody's thoughts on the book. I think the structure of the book and the chapters is really interesting. I think it's something that hasn't been done in one book. It feels like it's been done in several books, some type of way, shape, or form. But the way you put it together is really unique. And I'm looking forward to not only this series, but to when the book comes out, because I think it'll be really interesting and fun.
We can help Gary do that, because just by coming, so he will know that we are coming, so he will have to produce something, and he obviously produces some incredible stuff every time. Kwan, what do you think?
Sorry for the delay. I think what is interesting here is the theosis process is offering the way precisely, okay, to become Christlike. Or if you allow me to mix a little bit of Buddhist vocabulary, to become infinite awareness, or having infinite awareness in you, okay, or being infinite awareness. So what Shrikant said is quite interesting. Okay, so catharsis is the old man dying. Theoria is absorbing Christ. In my language, I would have said absorbing infinite awareness, but let's not be too bothered by differences of vocabulary. And theosis is precisely being in everyday life with that infinite awareness of that Christ consciousness, okay? Because as all of you know, Christos means anointed. So anointed with the sign of infinite awareness, if you want.
Wonderful, beautifully put. Thank you. Paul, what do you think?
I think it'll be a challenging journey for you, which is good, right? Exactly. And the thing you said about Gary, about the quotes, people quoting John like Putin, gets at the essence of why it's challenging. So you're trying to crack that nut partially in this effort. So I really respect that. So I'll be following it with interest. We'll see if I can reliably show up as a question, but I am very interested, and I will make my best effort.
Cool. Jeannie, Joe, and DLJ. Jeannie. You need to unmute. You need to unmute. Okay. All right. Joe, followed by DLJ.
Yeah, I mean, I think Gary, you have both the vigor, the belief, as well as the skill set and the talent to put something together. So I'm always excited to witness that type of journey. Yeah, I'll be here as often as I can. And
see if I can have it done in the next 2 or 3 weeks.
That's good. Well, then I'm just going to be jealous. So I'll be guilty of envy. So then I'll have another problem on my hands there. So in any case, no, I think it's ambitious, and I think that again, your desire to contribute something that helps people, as along with your skill set, is I think you're directing your energy in the right direction.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yelche.
Yeah, I'm with you on the theme in terms of emulating theosis, right? Emulating Jesus, is that the good summary?
Yeah.
Problem is, for me, it's the wrong Jesus. The Jesus I like is the Jesus after AD 33 financial crisis. What do you have after a financial crisis? You have a proletariat uprising led by a carpenter. So yes, the world needs a proletariat uprising, and I'm with you on that. But it's the wrong Jesus for me that you're talking about.
All right. On that hearty laugh, thank you very much, Gary. And we'll see you again next Thursday. Bye, everybody.
Thank you all. See ya.